Hi guys, Marissa here. I'm the owner and curator for Wild Canvas Design, and this is going to be a process video for making one of my cutting boards. So thank you for watching. Before we get into the process of how I make one of my cutting boards, I just want to talk about resin safety. Because I feel like I've watched a lot of these videos and sometimes the artist talks about safety for resin and sometimes they don't. So I just wanted to make sure I touched on that. So before we go into the actual art, I want to make sure you guys know that resin, they claim resin to be safe once it's cured, most of the resins. But while it's curing and while you are mixing it produces a lot of toxic gases. And these gases can cause different health problems, one of them being pneumonia. So you want to make sure that you are wearing a respirator while you are working with resin. I have a respirator with the cartridges on the side. I always make sure I get organic vapor cartridges, 3M 60923. So it says organic vapor acid gas cartridge on it. This one specifically also helps for if you're gonna sand the resin, which I do frequently, so that's why I have those ones. But as long as it says organic vapor, you should be good. The other thing you want is nitrile gloves. So vinyl gloves tear too easily. You wanna get nitrile gloves to wear while you're working with resin. You do not want resin to touch your skin. Even if you don't have any kind of reaction the first time resin touches your skin, you can end up developing an allergic reaction to this and you can have skin irritation and everything else. So yeah, but if resin does touch your skin, a lot of people jump to using alcohol, like rubbing alcohol, but that actually breaks the resin down and then it can get into your skin. So what you want to actually use, I know some people use that orange soap. I think it's called Fast Orange or something like that. But I use white vinegar. White vinegar gets resin off great. So I always have white vinegar in my studio while I'm working with resin so that I can quickly grab it if I get any resin on my skin. But when I'm doing resin, I typically have long sleeves, I have my gloves on, I'm wearing my mask. Some people wear eye protection. If you're nervous that the resin could splash into your eye, you can wear goggles or some kind of eye protection. Another thing just to touch on safety, you want to make sure wherever you're doing your resin that it's a well-ventilated area. You don't want to be doing resin in a room in your house that you frequently go in and out of, or that somebody else in your house or your pet goes in and out of, because all those fumes are going to be off-gassing for the next 12 to 24 hours while this piece cures. So I do mine in the garage. I don't even do it in the house at all, even behind a closed door, because I don't want anything to happen to anybody that I live with. So that's up to you, but make sure wherever you're doing this, it is a well-ventilated area. That being said, I have a heated garage. That's why I can do it in the garage in the winter. So you also need to make sure that the area that you're doing the resin is at least, look at the bottle of your resin to see what the temperature needs to be, but most of them I believe are 70 to 85 degrees. I haven't had any issues going down to like 65, but once you go down to 60 and below, you're gonna have a hard time with this resin curing. When resin is too cold, you can get a lot of air bubbles for one. Two, it cures, like, it's not very hard. It's very bendy when it cures when it's too cold. This isn't structural resin, so it's not gonna be a huge deal if it doesn't cure like completely hard, but at the end of the day, you're gonna want this surface to be, to cure properly. So those are the tips about safety. So now I'm gonna jump into the materials that I use. So for resin, I have always used Pro Marine Supplies. They have a tabletop resin, they have a casting resin, they have an art resin. For cutting boards, because your resin needs to be food safe, you need to use a tabletop food safe resin. In this video, I'm actually going to be using Total Boat. I recently got a gallon of Total Boat resin and I'm absolutely in love with it. I love it. So I would recommend, if you're using a food safe resin, either use Pro Marine Supplies or Total Boat. Those are really good brands, but I haven't really used that many other brands. So if you have a brand you like, feel free to use whatever resin that you want. The biggest thing about different types of resin is just the curing time and how well they mix with the pigments that you're using, and what type of resin it is. So just make sure you do some research on what type of resin you're using and what you're using it for. For pigments, you can color your resin with paint. You can use like an acrylic paint to color your resin, or you can use an ink. I like to use pigments that are made for resin. They are more expensive, but you use much less of them. So you use it for a longer period of time. So I feel like they're better for that. They're also just better product in general to mix with your resin. I find that when I'm mixing, because I've tried mixing acrylic paint with resin, I find it to be very streaky, but the pigments are made for resin and they really mix really well with the resin. So I use La Res pigments, and I buy them from Laura's Art Corner. They come really fast, and they are a good price. So those are the pigments I use. That's what I like. You can obviously use whatever you want if you're just starting and you don't want to invest in pigments. Using like a better acrylic paint to dye the resin would be best, that rather than using just a cheap acrylic paint. That's my 2 cents on coloring your resin. Other materials that you're gonna need. You need a heat gun and or a torch. I use both. I use the heat gun to make the waves, and I use the torch to pop the bubbles. The heat gun can pop the bubbles too, but the torch does a better job. So because I do waves, I have both a heat gun and a torch. So the heat gun I use to move the white pigment to make the waves, and the torch I use to pop the bubbles. I would recommend having both. If you're only going to use the heat gun, that's okay. You can use the heat gun to pop the bubbles and make the waves, so that's fine. You also need mixing cups. You can get the silicone mixing cups that the resin comes out really easily after it's cured. I have some of those. I also have some of the plastic mixing cups with the handles. As long as it has the measurements on the side so that you can see how much resin you're putting in there, because measuring the resin, and it's going to be a 1-to-1 ratio for the resin we're using today, the resin needs to be precise. You can mess around like with a little bit if it's okay, if it's not exactly 1-to-1, but it needs to be, the majority needs to be about 1-to-1. So you need to have the lines on the side, or some kind of, like the solo cups have marks on the side that are measurements, or if you have 2 cups and you measure them to each, that's okay. But as long as you know that you're getting the same amount of each part of the resin and the hardener, that's important. You're gonna need mixing sticks. So I just use regular craft sticks. I also have some of the ones that are reusable that you can peel the resin off after. So whatever you have, that's fine. You also need a level. You need to make sure your space is level, and then your piece is level, because resin is self-leveling. So if your space is not level, the resin's gonna move to one side and fall right off your piece. So you want to make sure that your space is level. The last thing you need is to make sure that you have a way to protect your piece from dust. So I have a very elaborate apparatus that my grandfather made for me, where I have like my table, and then I have a stand over my table, and I put the plastic sheeting over that. You don't need to do that. You can just have something that you can like drape plastic over your piece to create some kind of like tent looking thing so that you don't get any dust or bugs or anything in your resin, because once it's there and the resin cures, it's there permanently. So now we're gonna get into actually working with the resin.
Okay, so I taped my piece. This is optional. And now I am just making sure it's level. I placed it on pyramids. You can place it on cups. It doesn't really matter. It just needs to be off of your table. And not pictured, I poured my resin. Note that I have a lot of resin here. It's because I'm working on more than just this piece. So once you have equal parts, you're going to stir for about 4 minutes until each part is equally mixed together. So once my resin is all mixed, I'm going to separate the resin into smaller cups as pictured here, and then I'm going to stir each pigment into the cups. You want to follow the instructions for the type of pigment that you're using and only add as much as it allows. Okay, so now I'm going to start putting the resin onto the cutting board. So what I do is I typically go from the darker pigment to the lighter pigments. And here I'm picking something out of my resin. So if you get anything in your resin, make sure you try and get it out before the resin cures. Pro Marine Supplies and Total Boat have about a 30-minute working time, 30 to 45 minutes. So you have a good amount of time to work on your piece. So now I'm going to start blending the colors together. So I just use my gloved finger, but you can use one of your craft sticks to blend this as well, or there are, silicone brushes that you can use, whatever you would like to use, but I just find it's easier just to use my gloved finger. So I'm just blending them until I get the right consistency and colors that I want. And then I'm going to start to make the waves. Okay, so now I'm just going to add some clear resin to the bottom because I want there to be a barrier before I put the white resin down to make the waves. Okay, so here's my torch. So I'm just going to torch this just to pop all the air bubbles. So now I am mixing my white pigment into my resin. Note that I waited to do this until about 15 minutes after I mixed my resin. So now I'm just going to add a layer of white to the bottom. It does not have to be perfect because you're going to be using a heat gun to blow this to make waves. So I just add as much white as I want to the bottom, and then I'm going to start making the waves. And I'm just wiping this little area that I got too much white, so I'm just using vinegar on a paper towel to wipe this up. You can also use alcohol for this as well. pop the bubbles from the white pigment and just do another round of heating the rest of the resin as well. Alright, so now I'm going to use my heat gun. I have it on high heat and I have it on the fastest setting, and I'm just pushing the white over the colored pigments to create these waves. Okay, so now that the waves are the way that I like them, I'm going to take my blowtorch and I am going to heat the white to pop the bubbles and also to get the cells that I want to make the waves look like they're crashing. Okay, so it's been 24 hours, so now I'm going to start on my second coat. So I've already mixed my resin, I've already added the pigments, and now I'm just going to start making the second coat of waves. So now that I've blended the wave, like in the first layer, I'm going to add a barrier of clear in between the blue and teal colors and the white pigment. So this is going to allow the white to move over the clear, and it's going to be easier to do lacing with and get that effect of crashing waves. Torching my resin and popping all of the air bubbles. And now I'm adding my white pigment for the crashing waves. So now I am taking my heat gun on high heat and I am going to blow the white pigment over the clear to create my crashing waves. So what I did here was I added just a little bit too much white. So just as something to note, start with a small amount of white. You can always add more. You cannot not take it away. So now I'm just, continuing to blow the white out just to break it up a little bit. Now I am torching the white, and I'm popping the bubbles, so I'm getting the lacing effect that I want. Okay, so this is the next day, so this is day 3. My board is done. I'm not going to do any more waves on it, and now I'm just going to be taking off the cured bits of resin off the sides and back. So if you're taking this off of the back, you're going to do the same thing. You're just heating the resin with your heat gun. If you have tape like I do, you're just going to heat it until you can pull the tape off cleanly, so you don't get any breaking resin but just clean lines. If you did not tape, you're going to be doing a different technique where you heat the resin and then you're going to be scraping it off with a palette knife. So I'm just heating the resin over the tape until the tape starts to come free. So I'm just going to check now to see if the tape is able to come off. Okay, so you can see I still need to heat that part a little bit more because it's not coming free. So you can see some of the resin got underneath the tape. It's really not that big of a deal. We're just going to fix it when we sand. So now I am sanding the board using 120 grit sandpaper. And I'm also sanding the sides to make sure that they are smooth. We're going to use food safe mineral oil to oil this board since it's a cutting board. So I'm just pouring some oil on and I'm just going to mix it around with my hands. And here's the finished product.
Thank you so much for watching this video. If you make a cutting board, please share it with me and tag me on Facebook or Instagram. You can find me at Wild Canvas Design. And if you have any questions, please message me. I try to get back to everybody that messages me. Thanks.